Welcome back to Python programming from beginner to programmer. We're in the middle of discussing and learning about SQL essentials and trying to use SQLite Studio to try out, to experiment interactively how to process database access commands. So let's get on with our discussion by learning how to group the rows together based on certain columns. So the idea is to use group by, all right, in SQL select statements to be able to organize the rows dynamically and immediately by their values, by their content. Okay, based on the content of certain columns. So back to the same example of customer and transact, we would like to be able to answer a business question like, what is the customer name? And also, how much is the highest total amounts spent with the restaurant? Total amount. So this time round, as kind of distinctly different from the previous example where we say, what is the single highest transaction amount? Right? It can be that the whole database only has one customer and she spent 10 times, right? She visited the restaurant 10 times, all with different amounts, and the highest amount will be uh, the one with the highest expenditure. But right now we may have multiple customers, so we like to know who is that guy or the person who in total has the highest amount spent in all our customers. So that's a slightly differently worded question, and yet it used totally different way of performing this calculation, because logically we would have to group the customer expenditures first. Some customer might not even have visited and spent with our restaurants, isn't it? So we will have a lot of names, and then each name will have a lot, zero or more transactions, right? And we have to sum up those transactions not in totality but per customer basis. Or let me insert the magic word, per unique customer basis. So group by is always that tool to use in SQL whenever you have such a keyword unique and for all. So for each unique customer, who has the highest expenditure? Now, the latter part, we'll try to use filter and functions like sum amount to do that. But then sum amount also needs to know where's the boundary of my summing. Is it over everything or per customer? And how do I do that, right? So the group by is the magic word to answer or to at least be able to digest a lot of this logic easily using just group by. What group by does is it takes one column, tell me which column, and group by will inspect the value, the data content in that column for all the rows. And you can imagine that it's not sorting, but it's grouping. So all the Kate expenditures will be grouped together. All the Bill expenditures, all the Mary expenditures will be grouped together. And why Kate, Bill, and Mary? Because they are unique customer IDs. Because IDs are unique, right, in the primary key. So they are unique IDs, and therefore group by will put all the transactions together. But customer doesn't have transaction amounts and information, and transact doesn't have customer names and address information, because that's the way we organize the data. So of course we can use um, different means such as inner join and cross join, right, to link them. And as we already studied in the previous video segment, the best way in such a situation where we have customer and then event, right, transaction, customer, transaction, member, transaction, the best way to create such a virtual table is not by cross join and then putting a where filtering condition, but by inner join with an on which column, right? So let's try to understand the group by behavior first, which is to say, let's just focus on one table. Let's say the transact table. So when we organize by transact table, we can group by customer ID. So all the ones, twos, and threes to be together. Now remember, group by has no obligation to sort for you. I'm just listing this out because it's easier on the eyes. But there is no obligation for group by to sort. For example, in the case of yeah, so it could happen that in the memory, three can be stored before one and before two. So when we do a group by, it is definitely true that all the rows having the same value as the column name given here, customer ID. So having all the ones here will be grouped together. Then this automatically forms a boundary scope for whatever aggregate function we have. So when you have group by, it is always, well, I should say not always, but very commonly accompanied by an aggregate function. Because if you don't have an aggregate function, you probably don't want to use group by, or else the logic for or the reason for using group by might be a bit not correct. Yeah. So therefore, that's why I say it's almost always the case that we see some sort of an aggregation function when we use group by. What's an aggregation function? It's the kind of simple mathematical function where you take a lot of numbers and you combine them by giving out one number. That's all. That's all that's required. For example, sum. I take 1 to 10, I add them all up, right? And I give the final total. I can take median. Median will line them all up so that the middle value is the number that's being returned. I can find the standard deviation, the maximum, the minimum. All these take all kinds of information, data, numbers, and give out one number as a result. So all these are aggregation function. Now, what's the big deal here? The big deal here is that we need to aggregate all the ones, as indicated by the green rows here, all the numbers here in the amount belonging to group customer ID 1 into one number. Here we choose total, but we could also ask who has the highest average expenditure, because the customer might spend low on one, but otherwise he or she spends a lot most of the time, right? So we want the high average customer expenditure. Then we would change this to average rather than sum. So average is definitely an aggregation function because it takes a lot of numbers and finds the average as a single output number. So group by paired with aggregation function. So select everything, comma, additionally sum, that means the aggregation function, sum the amount column. But this might seem like on its own, it will add up everything if we didn't have group by. So group by both groups the rows together according to the column value, and at the same time provides a scope for the aggregation function to operate over. So therefore, what group by produces is going to be a table with unique values in the customer ID. It's unique value, but it's not necessarily, in fact, it's not primary key. We did not designate this to be a primary key. We can group by that column and all the unique values will come out. All right. And then the aggregation function amount over each unique value rows will be sort of accompanying that column value, which is a customer ID here. And then we can select other columns. So we are selecting everything just to have a look. Additionally, we want the aggregation amount, sum amount, and this as SX here relabels, because if you don't put the as SX, it will work, but it will appear as a column name called sum bracket amount. Now, if you have that, you are unable to refer to that column from there on. That means that output result cannot be used as a table for further selects, because the bracket cannot be defined as cannot be used as a column name, but can be printed out as a column name. So you need to redefine that as SX. So the output table will have the total amount renamed as SX. Then we can sort of process it further if we need to sub-select from there on. 好 all right, so that is group by, how group by behaves if we only operate on one table.